The NZXT H510, the most popular case on Amazon.com. Now, why are so many people buying this case? Let's try to find out. What's up everyone, Erik here and welcome to Hardware for Gamers. Now before I get into the overview of the H510, I do buy all the products that I review myself. So if you like what I'm doing here, can you please hit that like button and subscribe? It helps out the channel a lot. Now I also have an Amazon Associates link, so if you click on one of the links in the description and then add an item or items to the cart and order them, the channel gets a small kickback. Okay, with all that out of the way, the dimensions of the H510 are 46 centimeters high by 21 centimeters wide by 43 centimeters deep. NZXT does provide a small box that has the screws and fittings in it. There are also some zip ties in there. NZXT also includes a headset splitter, which is pretty nice to see. There is also a double-sided booklet that illustrates pretty much nothing and is pretty much a complete waste of paper. Now speaking of waste, everything in this box has been separated out into their own little baggies. So there is quite a bit of plastic waste, which is not cool, NZXT. Why are you, just really? Now taking a look at the case itself, the H510 has a solid front panel. Now it's not really a front panel, rather it's part of the chassis and it is riveted in. Taking a closer look at the front, there are two air intakes, one along the right side and one along the bottom. Both of these intakes have removable filters. The front I/O is located on the top of the case. There is a combo headset port for both the audio out and microphone. There is one USB 3.0 Type A port, and there is one USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type C port, and a power button. So there is no reset button, which I don't really like the idea of very much, but this is what they give you. Now along the top of the case, there is also a 120mm exhaust fan. The tooling here will also allow for a 140mm fan. Moving to the rear of the case, we see the location of the rear I/O and a second 120mm exhaust fan. There are 7 horizontal expansion slots, all with reusable covers. These covers are held in by a bracket. And finally, at the bottom, we see the power supply location. Taking a look at the bottom of the case, there are 4 plastic feet. These feet allow for 28mm of ventilation. The feet do have rubber pads on them to help stop the case from sliding around. There is a removable dust filter for the power supply. This dust filter is accessed from the rear of the case. Moving on to the right side of the case, there is a steel side panel. To remove the right side panel, you need to undo the 2 captive thumb screws at the rear of the case, then slide the panel back and lift it away. The side panel is just a bent sheet of steel with some small grooves in it, but it should do a good enough job. The removable dust filter is fitted to the panel. To remove the filter, just pinch the corner of the filter, then lift it up and pull it away. Moving to the right side of the case, the main left side panel is tempered glass. To remove the glass panel, you need to undo the 1 captive thumb screw at the rear of the case, then pull the top of the panel away from the chassis. Once the panel is free, tilt the panel back and lift it away. Now, the lower metal panel covering the basement is riveted in, so the only way to access the power supply location is from the right side of the case. Now, before taking a look at the inside of the case, if you are finding this video helpful, you may want to check out some of my other case reviews. I'll link a card above to that playlist. Okay, as I just said, there is a basement, and the top of the shroud has 2 good sized cutouts for running cables. The top of the shroud also has these ventilation holes, which should allow the GPU to access a lot of air, but we'll find out if that's the case in the temperature testing. Now taking a look at the motherboard tray, there is 1 large cutout along the top for the EPS cables and for the fan connectors, but most of the cables will be running through the large vertical cutout in the middle, which does have a cover. This cover can be moved closer to the front of the case to give a little bit more room for running cables, or if you don't like the cover, it can be removed. There is also a fan cradle or bracket located at the front of the case, so if you are looking to install some fans or an AIO, you will need to remove this cradle. It is pretty easy to remove. just undo the 2 captive thumb screws, swing the cradle back, and lift it away. Now the H510 does support mini ITX, micro ATX, and ATX motherboards. The maximum GPU length is 381 millimeters, but that will be cut down if you add fans to the front, and will be cut down even more if you add a front-mounted radiator. The H510 allows for a maximum CPU cooler height of 165 millimeters. Okay, it's time to take a look at the backside of the motherboard tray, where we see two 2.5-inch drive sleds. NZXT also gives up to 28 millimeters behind the motherboard tray for running cables. There are a few cable tie-offs and 2 cable channels. One of the channels runs around the top rear corner, and the other runs alongside the vertical cutout in the middle. The cable channel in the middle does have 2 Velcro strips to help with cable management. Now, if you don't like the cable channels or they're getting in your way, they can be removed. Now, as I mentioned before, the cover for the vertical cutout can be moved or removed. Either way, the cover will need to be unscrewed. To do this, you need to remove 5 screws. Now, if you want to move the cover, just slide the cover towards the front of the case, making sure to align the screw holes, then screw the cover back in. Now, if you don't want the cover, simply just remove the cover from the case once you have the screws removed. Moving on to the basement, we see a 3-bay drive cage for 3.5-inch drives. This drive cage can be moved or removed. To move the drive cage, loosen the 4 screws on the bottom of the case, slide the cage to your desired location, and then tighten those screws. Now, to remove the drive cage, simply just undo all 4 of those screws and lift the cage out. Now, with the drive cage in its stock orientation, there is 280 millimeters given for the power supply and cables. Then with the drive cage in its rearmost position, there is 260 millimeters given for the power supply and cables. So there really isn't too much of a difference between the front and rear positions. Now, if the drive cage is removed, there'll be just over 430 millimeters for the power supply and cables. Also, at the front of the case, there is the removable dust filter. This dust filter is removed by pinching the clip and lifting the filter out. Now, moving on to the cooling options of the H510, there are 2 120mm exhaust fans pre-installed, one at the rear and one along the top. These fans are 3-pin fans with a rated RPM of 1200. They are rifle-bearing fans, so they should last quite some time, but the H510 can support up to 4 120mm fans. That's 2 fans at the front, 1 fan along the top, and 1 fan at the rear. Now, if you prefer to have 140mm fans, then you can have up to 3 140mm fans. So that's 2 fans at the front and 1 fan along the top. Now, for radiator support, you can have up to a 240mm at the front and a 120mm at the rear. Okay, that's it for the overview, so now on to my build notes. Starting off with the cable channels, they worked actually pretty well. I was thinking I was going to have to remove them, but I didn't have to. Even with the cable extensions, I was able to fit everything in all nice and tight. Now, that is because I routed the 8-pin PCIe cable from the basement, but that's the intended design of the case, so I'm allowing that. Now, the cover for the vertical cutout in its stock orientation just seemed to bite on the cables a little too much for my liking. So I did end up sliding it forward to get a nicer bend out of the 24-pin cable extension. Now, by doing this, it seems that I can no longer fit an AIO at the front of the case because the cover itself is now blocking it. So that is something to keep in mind if you're wanting to go with an AIO and cable extensions. Now, NZXT does provide this front panel split out adapter thing, but the front connector thing that they provide works for both AMD and Intel motherboards. So I'm not really sure what motherboards would need to actually have this split out adapter thing. So I'm just mentioning this more so that if you just see it and go, what is this for? Or do I need this? There's a pretty good chance you're not going to need it. Now, again, if you have plugged in the front end connector and it's still not working, then you'll need to actually use the breakout splitter thing. Okay, so that's it for the build notes. So on to the temperature testing. But before I get into the temperature testing results, if you do have any questions on how I test the cases, check out my case testing video. I'll link it in the card above and I'll also have it in the description below. And that should answer most of your questions on how I test these cases. Starting off with the CPU testing, In its stock configuration, the max CPU temperature reached 58.5 Celsius. And then when I added 2 front intakes along with those 2 stock fans, had the max CPU temperature hit 57.1 Celsius. Then in the fan normalized testing, the max CPU temperature hit 56.1 Celsius. Then with the fan normalized testing and the filters removed, the max CPU temperature hit 55.9 Celsius. So really not too much of a difference. Those filters aren't doing all that much. Now comparing the stock CPU temperatures to the other cases I've tested, the H510 is in around the middle of the list, which isn't bad or isn't good. It's okay. Now in the fan normalized test, the H510 is now second from the bottom, which is bad and not good. Okay, now moving on to the GPU testing. And this is where things get a little odd because we have the stock setup at the top of the list with the max GPU temperature of 53.1 Celsius. Then in the fan normalized testing, the max GPU temperature hit 54.9 Celsius. And it then just gets worse from there. Now this indicates that this case needs to be in negative air pressure to keep the GPU at an ideal temperature. Now when comparing the stock GPU temperatures to the other cases I've tested, the H510 is on the top end of the list. And in the fan normalized test, it still performed well, landing in between the 4000D airflow and the land cooled 215. So what do I think of the NZXT H510? It is a pretty nice case. The price is really nice, I do have to admit that. And it is really nice to build in. It looks pretty nice, and it comes in different colors, which gives you options, which I'm all for. But you do need to be very careful when adding fans, because this case needs to be in or have a negative air pressure to not have the GPU cook itself. But that's not the case for the CPU. The CPU still needs fresh air. Now I do want to be clear, the stock CPU and the stock GPU temperatures were fine with a CPU air cooler. But if you're wanting to have an AIO in this case, you do need to be aware of how much air you're bringing into the case, or your GPU may end up cooking itself. Well, that's all I got for this one. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're still watching, maybe think about subscribing and clicking that bell icon so you get notified whenever I drop a new video. Please follow me on Twitter at HFG_YT. I also have a Discord server. The link is in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching and see you next time.